So thank you. I think that in terms of my own research, that this book brings together two main areas that I've been working with throughout my academic career, and also as a social worker, although that was quite a long time ago, I should say. But I am a social worker scholar from the beginning, and I must say that educating into a social work scholar has for me been related to many doubts. It's not that I don't think that the discipline as such or the field is not important, on the contrary, but it's just that finding one's space within that particular discipline to do the things you think is important, also in times when there may be a dominant view that some issues are not important. So that made me actually go from, when I started to study social work, for a period of time I went to gender studies. That was in the beginning of the late 1980s and the late 1990s, beginning of 2000, where I moved from the Department of Social Work to Gender Studies. And I became very dedicated to doing research and analysis and also teaching around issues of power. And that later shaped my relationship to social work, I think more interdisciplinary, into gender studies and also intersectionality studies. And further on to social issues of social justice linked with social work and globalization. And that's something that I explore further in this book. I think also why it has a section on methodologies is that during all these years, I've also been engaged in trying to engage in developing methodologies for social justice that would push the boundaries of the established forms of publishing. So that would mean that I would, together with colleagues in various disciplines, work, for example, with different ways of writing. So writing methodologies in terms of transgressing genres, because there is a side of social work that argues very strongly, of course, for creating spaces for new voices. Adrienne Chambon, for example, is one of those scholars who developed that path. And what I would like to do is more to explore that in this book. How is it possible to develop situated knowledges and to push the boundaries for methodologies? So that is a starting point. And I would like to say, of course, that this project is not a project I do on my own. I'm very much depending on and collaborating with a group of colleagues, scholars in social work and associated disciplines. So I will talk more about that. And the co-editor is Associate Professor Leah Bryant. She's at the Center for Social Change at University of South Australia. And she's also recently came out with a book, I would like to say, that she edited called Critical and Creative Research Methodologies in Social Work, which is a fantastic book. Let me see now. So today I will talk about this. First, I would like to briefly just say a few words about the global agenda for social work and the global definition of social work. Some of you here are not scholars in social work, but I hope this may also interest you. And why I do that is because, of course, it's much a debate whether someone could have a global definition of a field, and that would be applied by all people in that field, and whether it would be too generalistic. But I do believe that the international organizations of social work that promoted these kind of definitions and documents really have been helpful in creating a basis for social work that would promote a voice for social work that would be more known to the public. So World Social Work Day, for example, coming up tomorrow, is part of such a project, and therefore I think it's important. Also, I would like to set the scene for emergent issues and methodological challenges then. And I think that this would be a broader framework that would hopefully be of interest to many of you. And then the book project. what would be the main contribution that we would like to make from this book project? And there, the concept and theories of glocalization then would be central for that. And then some of the examples from chapters in the book. The global agenda in social work is a document that was created on the basis of the 3 organizations in social work: the Federation of Social Workers, Associations of Schools of Social Work, and Council of Social Welfare. And these 3 organizations was founded in 1928. And during a long period of time now, they have been voicing from the perspective of international social issues, they have been collaborating, for example, with the Economic and Social Council in the United Nations and so on. And they have been developing questions around social work for a long time. But what happened now in 2012 and the years before 2012 was an agreement that actually it was important with a global agenda for social work. And there were 4 overarching goals for social work. Then I will just mention them now and come back to talk a little bit more about them. Promoting social and economic equalities. And I think we all know that we live in an unequal world to a very great extent, and that there are major challenges with poverty, which is a core question for social work. The dignity and worth of people has to do with diversity. It has to do with how structural conditions in societies and on a global scale prevents people from living their life in freedom, and sometimes also be subjected to violence due to their ethnic background or sexual orientation, for example. So that these are very important questions. Working toward environmental sustainability is a question that emerged very strongly during the later years, and some scholarship in social work has been really very well developed there already, but it's a question that we need to continue to work with. And then strengthening and recognition the importance of human relationships. And this is, of course, I think that the global agenda emphasizes very much a collective responsibility among humans for human relationships that are based on human worth and dignity and human rights. I think it's just interesting to bring up the global definition of social work because it also shows a shift in conceptualization of social work internationally. In 2001, we had the international definition of social work. And it had the same approach, you could say, like this definition, the global definition, but it was shorter and it didn't take up certain issues or aspects that the global definition does. So my interpretation is, firstly, that the concept of the global enters more strongly into social work in an international context. And the second is, there are some notes I make. Firstly, it says that social work is a practice-based profession and academic discipline that promotes social change and development and the empowerment and liberation of people. It justifies the social justice perspective and human rights perspective and a collective responsibilities and respect for diversities. And this is also what the previous definition did, less slightly defined. But then I think that something new enters here. It's underpinned by theories of social work, the social sciences, humanities, and indigenous knowledge. And this is something that the previous definition did not have. I think this is a shift of putting a marker into the realities that Western theories has been very influential and dominant in ways in which we understand the world. And also the global definition makes a statement that science is more understood as knowledge. And I also note that the concept of knowledge here opens up not only for established science and social science, but also knowledge brought in from, for example, indigenous people and the value base and the realities under which many indigenous people live. So that's one important aspect. Yes. To set the scene then for emergent issues and methodologies, this is a huge field, of course, but I would like to look into some of the core issues for social work today. And I would actually say that I think in many respects that the social work profession and scholarship today are moving forward to take into account new issues that I think that many people in the public field and in the society wouldn't say that social work was a question for social work. So part of this, I think, for scholars and social workers is to pave way for saying that these are questions for social work. I think that's important. There was a theme issue in the British Journal of Social Work in 2014 that talked about emergent issues in terms of a world on the move. And I think that this conceptualized the questions in a very good way. I have used this overall conceptualization to also build on what scholarship in social work have worked with in terms of writings and literature in this field, and also, of course, social workers in the field. One major question, of course, is migration, refugees, and asylum seekers. And as we know, migration is not a new issue. What is emergent today is, of course, the crisis that occurs in the refugee question, and ways in which it challenges national states to take on responsibility. And also, of course, it actualizes many of the relationship between colonized people and their colonizers. So colonization is a question in this. War and conflict is also a source. And I think that what happens then, because I wrote that, hostilities to refugees, I think that what's important then is not only the questions, of course, of the right to safely seek shelter in another place than where there is war and where you have a very difficult economic situation, but it's also what happens when you enter into the new space as a new citizen, or when you're denied citizenship. So the hostilities to refugees is also very much today, I think, reproduced through a language of refugees as a burden or as costs for society. And there, I think the media has a great responsibility, but we all have a responsibility in ways in which we actually talk and address these issues and act. Gendered violence and human trafficking and sexual abuse is also something that is not a new question, but there is a feminization of migration that has been noted, that more and more women, of course, are among refugees. By saying that, I don't say that women are vulnerable and men are not, just that more the exploitation of women tends to be then, for example, within the globalization of care change and working in homes, being not recognized in their work situation, and also being exposed to sexual abuse. Unaccompanied minors is another question which is a great challenge and an important question for social work. And I would say in Sweden right now, that we have a lack of social workers, and this question is one of those. To reconceptualize welfare in national and global context is a very accurate question. So how do nation states actually relate to what is welfare and who is included and not? And here I think many social workers are in the middle of a dilemma that on the one hand they should provide on an equal basis the security and the right to a good life for all people. On the other hand, national rules and regulation in terms of welfare would maybe exclude people and dislocate people. So this would be a dilemma. Yes, I think that environmental changes, drought and other natural disasters are a key issue. And as I learned, one of the colleagues here at Social Work has actually created a network for social work and extreme events. So there are a number of questions. What about then the innovation of social work research when it comes to methods? I had a previous heading that was emergent methods, and then the question of how the discipline responds to that in kinds of movement. I think that social work are in a situation where there is an emerging body of work challenging the disciplinary boundaries of how we are supposed to do research. I think there are a lot of new ways of working when it comes to working with a range of different data, for example, using interviews in a range of ways, working with archival material, doing ethnography in new ways, doing spatial analysis. But I do believe that, and this is all brought up actually in these theme issues and in many other journals for social work that focus on methods, and now I'm talking mainly about qualitative methods. Of course, there is also new or emerging approaches to mixed methods. But what we argue in this book then, and I will talk a little bit more about this, is that this should also, to some extent at least, change ways in which academics do their practice as writers, as ways in which we shape the knowledge to communicate with the diverse audiences. I think that Bell Hooks once said that if you write a book, you should write it in a way that a reader could go into a bookshop and then read a chapter and see if the book would be something like it would be readable, accessible. And I also think that questions around the language in academic spaces that tends to a great extent to be very alienating and non-emotional actually speaks against the whole reality of globalization and social work and all the suffering and issues that we encounter in social work, both research and the realities. What is the main contribution of the book? Now, what I will not do in this presentation today is that I will not take you through the different established conceptualizations on social work, the global, international, and transnational. But I will come into that when we look more into what we argue for in the book in terms of glocalization. But so first of all, I wish to say that there is already, of course, a rich and very inspiring and important body of literature around international, global, and transnational social work. In particular, I would say that the concept of international has been the major framing network around these issues for a long time. And of course, it has to do with the starting point of social work as an international social work, linking together questions and concerns that are related between countries, and how international organizations in social work also bear these conceptualizations in their names. But within that conceptualization of international, I think that then the emerging concepts have been global and transnational. And as you hear from the words, I wouldn't say that there would be a clear-cut differences between these conceptualizations, but that global, of course, have this idea of the global, the whole, the round of the world. And it would be also very much theorized in, for example, sociology and other, well, sociology, I think, is the discipline that is mostly have been used in social work to understand globalization so far. So there is this rich body of literature within that field. Also, scholars like Leonardo Minelli and Lynn Healy and many others now have done this work. And a book which is great, I think, is Vivian Cree's, I think you remember, mentioned this with Becoming a Social Worker, with the global narratives where social workers, both established scholars and students, give accounts of ways in which they entered into social work and where they're placed and what they think about social work challenges. So there is this rich literature. But what we would like to do is to reframe social work through the conceptualization of glocalization. So I will talk about that in a minute, ways in which we do that. And this doesn't mean that all authors in the book, as you will see, use glocal. They would use the range of established conceptualizations that already are there, but they will pay attention to how they use them and pay attention to the linkage between the global and the local and the realities of the issues they address. And I would say for social work, it's important to try to come as close to the realities of people's lives, the questions of concerns. I think that it tends to be that theories of globalization also have tended to be abstract in the way they address issues around the social. We will also like to gain insight into emergent questions, like in a range of contexts, by taking examples from a diversity of countries and situations. And here I mention a few countries, but I would like to, at the same time, to emphasize that it's not the actual national border of a country that is interesting here. It's the events that take place and ways in which they transgress national borders. So, for example, the tsunami in Japan, or farmer suicide in Australia, or questions around water and rights of water are not only, of course, questions that concerns one national context. And that is the whole challenge, I think, for social work, is that social issues of today don't respect national borders. They transgress borders. So the question is, how do social work, scholarship, and practice and meet these questions? And then we have a section called methodological reshaping. And here we go into interdisciplinary approaches linked with areas, and I want to mention two areas here. One is cultural geography, and the other one is the creative arts. So why these two areas? Well, the reason is that space and spatial analysis is becoming more and more, we argue, important for social work. Because of issues around globalization and social work and the contestation of space and place and power, so that is a core issue. Also to promote working creatively, to open up for new collaborations with the creative arts. So that is something that we do in the book. So not only that social work scholars work with creative methods, but that artists also can contribute to a book in social work. So that is important for us. And then we argue, and there the feminist theories around situated knowledges is something that we draw on, and to work with situated knowledges and a politics of location for local social work, and I will talk a little bit about that. So here is where I will stop for a while and talk more about. And important for me, sometimes publisher would say that you need to use the word method, because that's the word nowadays that actually, is the key word for everything you do. But I argue for methodological to be there. And that is why I think that methodological reminds me that all kinds of approaches that we work with are always informed by theory. For me, that's the case. So I think that to be reminded of that, methodology would then be a bridge between epistemology and method. So, for example, well, how do we know something, and who can know, and who can write, and where we're writing from, would be epistemological questions of concern to develop knowledge in social work. So in a global context, then, we would be accountable and limit our knowledge claims. And this is what Donna Haraway argued for when she developed situated knowledges, which of course has been taken further but by other scholars. Glocalization, then, what we do in this book is that we take a departure in the early work of Robertson, who in the early 1990s argued for the concept of glocalization. I would like to say here now that we don't say that by using the concept of glocalization, we solve all the questions that are difficult with studies within this field. But we do say that it is interesting that when we use concepts, if they integrate two terms, we're more likely to actually pay attention to that the relationship are there all the time. So, and Robertson's one of the main arguments was that the concept of global neglected, in which the local is constructed on a global basis. So if you look at local social issues now, I think that they have global connections, like I have given examples of. So that is one of the key arguments. And I also mentioned that social workers today act in tension between the national welfare system and what you could call dislocated service users. I could see actually that some of the advertisement for the World Social Work Day actually use the specific term dislocated. And that is important, I think, because it says something about, I mean, all people have a voice, but sometimes people are not listened to. Their voices are not heard, because there is this power relation of dislocation and location in particular aspects. So this is very important then, how the glocalization of care work is also a very important question in this sense. And we have particularly one chapter looking at how care work in the Philippines, how care workers that go to different parts of the world, which is quite a great part of the Filipino population, around 11%, go to particular areas of the world where the welfare systems wouldn't include their work conditions, but also how they would be exploited by their employers in a variety of ways. And also at the same time, they would, of course, leave their families to other carers in their home countries. So there is this global chain of care work that would be local and global. Another argument would be that Robertson brought forward was that global neglects spatial, and I have added also social dimensions, morely than relating to work within cultural geography, like, for example, Dorian Massey, who argues very, very strongly that space are filled with power relations. And these global spaces and ways in which power relations are created today very much says something about new geographies of power. So the problematization of social space and power are important in this book. questions around geographical mobility and the politics of space, and people's ways in which we live. Many people would live in multiple locations and transnational lives. And as you could see, also the example from the World on the Move brings up how, I mean, not only migrants that flee from war and conflict, for example, or difficult life conditions, but it's also academics and scholars and social workers and the training of social workers in different national contexts that set people on the move. And living transnational lives, here I think that the concept of transnational social work is important because it emphasizes how transnational lives are really a complexity of living in different locations at the same time. And there is this wonderful study by a Swedish scholar looking at a suburb in Sweden. Often these suburbs would be considered as something that would be dislocated and of negative value. But looking into the everyday life, and she talks about the glocalization of everyday lives, you see a range of living life in a range of ways, connecting to different parts of the world, and maybe not traveling so often to other locations in Sweden, but to other locations in the world, and also having multiple degrees from different parts of the world. So this would be something that would be degraded from the majority society. This would altering understandings of home, community, and locality would be a question of lived experiences, imagination, and belonging. And of course, there are a range of work around imagination and belonging within cultural studies and also within social work and sociology to be of central importance for this work. We think it's important to decolonize hegemonic making of nation and recognize indigenous knowledge and movements. So questions about recognition and subjugated and dislocated knowledges is a core issue. And there I think the section on methodological challenges and ways in which we want to work with issues around space is particularly important. There is this concept of methodological nationalism also, and I think we want to move beyond that to develop situated knowledges that challenges the nation state as organizer of social life, but also to promote accountability of knowledge claims and an ethics of representation. So this would be important in all studies, of course, to talk about ways in which, where do you conduct your study from, and what do you see, and how do you learn how to see this. And I think that scholarship that we draw on here is both Robertson as a departure, but also post-colonial feminist scholars like Mohanty and also the sociologist Bauman, Doreen Massey, who wrote a lot about space, and examples from studies in cultural geography and social work who really looks into the everyday lives of people. So I think this would be the main theoretical aspects and conceptualizations